I spent 3 years in a wheelchair, watching my wife care for me with a tired smile and distant eyes. I always knew that Dania never loved me. Knew that when she kissed my forehead before bed, it wasn't affection, it was obligation. Knew that when she held my hand in public, it wasn't because she wanted to, it was because people were watching, but I didn't care. As long as she stayed by my side, I convinced myself it was enough. Until today. Until I stood up from this damn chair and saw her kissing my best friend. Dania's hands gripped Ethan's shoulders, her lips pressed against his as if they had been waiting years for this moment. And maybe they had. Maybe the entire time I was trapped in this wheelchair, she had been waiting for the day she wouldn't have to play the role of a devoted wife. Clenched my fists. I had imagined my first steps countless times. Dreamed of the moment I would rise to my feet again. Imagined how Dania would cry with joy, throw herself into my arms, tell me she never stopped believing in me. But instead, she was tangled in Ethan's arms, lost in a kiss that should have belonged to me. My legs trembled, not from weakness, but from rage. At that moment, she must have sensed something, because suddenly she pulled away from him and turned. Her eyes met mine, shock, horror, and then fear. "Richard?" Her voice trembled. I didn't say a word. I just took another step forward. Because now, there was no turning back. I wasn't the weak, helpless man she thought I was anymore. And this time, I wouldn't pretend not to know. I was born into wealth, but fate was cruel enough to steal my legs from me. 3 years ago, a car accident shattered my spine and left me in this damn wheelchair. I had once been a man people respected, standing tall, leading our family's business, making tough decisions with unwavering confidence. But after the accident, I became a burden, a weak, immobile man whose own wife could barely stand to look at him. Dania and I had been married for 4 years. When we stood at the altar, she had smiled at me with a love so convincing, I almost believed it. Almost. Because even back then, I knew. She never married me for love. Dania had always wanted Ethan. He was my best friend, my right-hand man. A man who had stood beside me for years, smiling and pretending to have my back. I saw the way Dania's eyes softened when Ethan entered a room, how her lips curved slightly when he made her laugh, how she had to force herself to act like a wife to me, and after my accident, she stopped trying. I remember the first few months vividly. At the hospital, she sat beside me, playing the role of the perfect wife in front of doctors and nurses. She fed me when I was too weak to move, adjusted my blanket when I shivered, held my hand when visitors came. But when we were alone, she sat at the edge of the hospital bed staring at her phone, barely acknowledging me. I heard her sighs, saw the exhaustion in her eyes. It wasn't the exhaustion of a wife worried about her husband's recovery. It was the exhaustion of a woman who felt trapped, a woman who had been forced to give up the life she wanted because her husband no longer fit the picture. Ethan was there too, always visiting, bringing flowers, cracking jokes to lift my spirits. And Dania laughed at those jokes. She laughed with him the way she had never laughed with me. Still, I told myself it was just my imagination. That even if Dania didn't love me, at least she stayed. I clung to that, because I was too much of a coward to face the truth. The coldness between us. After I was discharged, our marriage became a performance. Dania woke up before me, left before. I could ask her to help me with simple things like getting out of bed. She came home late, sometimes smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and when she did see me, she smiled, but her smile never reached her eyes. "You should eat, Richard," she'd say, setting dinner on the table before disappearing into the bedroom. Not once did she sit down and eat with me. Not once did she ask if I needed help. She was physically present, but emotionally? She had left long ago. But again, I ignored it, because deep down I was scared. Scared that if I pushed too hard, she would leave me for good. Scared that if I called her out, she would confirm what I already knew. That she didn't love me. That She had been waiting for the moment she could be free. Ethan. The best friend or the snake? Ethan was my best friend since college. He had always been charismatic, always the guy who could walk into a room and steal all the attention. I had never minded, until I saw the way Dania looked at him. At first, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that she would never betray me, that he would never betray me. But in my wheelchair, I saw things differently. I saw the way Ethan leaned just a little too close when talking to Dania. I saw the way she smiled only for him. The small touches, the fleeting glances, the way she never looked at me the same way. It was like my accident had given me a front row seat to a play I had been blind to before. And the worst part? Neither of them thought I could see it, because I was trapped in this chair. Weak, helpless, powerless. The secret I kept from Dania. But what Dania and Ethan didn't know was that I wasn't as powerless as they thought. For the past 6 months, I had been undergoing experimental treatment, physical therapy, spinal, injections, everything possible to regain what I had lost. And 3 weeks ago, I stood up for the first time. The doctors called it a miracle. I called it a second chance. But I told no one. Not Dania, not Ethan, not even my own family. Because I wanted to see the truth with my own eyes. I wanted to know if my wife still cared. If my best friend was truly loyal, I wanted to walk into a room unannounced and catch them. And today, that's exactly what happened. Richard's first steps into betrayal I had been practicing every night in secret, slowly, painfully, step by step. And today, when I felt strong enough, I finally did it. I stood up from my chair. I took a step, then another and another. I went to find Dania. I wanted her to be the first to see me walking again. I wanted to surprise her. I wanted to see the joy in her eyes, to hear her voice crack with emotion as she said, "Richard, you did it." But instead, I walked into our house and saw her kissing Ethan. Not a casual, brief kiss, a deep, desperate kiss, like they had been starving for each other, like they had been waiting for me to disappear, like I had already been erased from their lives. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. Dania pulled away. She turned, saw me standing. Her face went pale, and for the first time in years, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Richard," she whispered. I stepped forward and smiled. Because now, I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know. Dania's lips were still parted from Ethan's kiss when she turned and saw me standing. For a second, I thought she might pass out. Her entire body froze. Her eyes, usually cold and indifferent, widened in absolute horror. "Richard," she whispered again, her voice shaking. Ethan, standing beside her, was equally stunned. His face lost all color, and his hands clenched as if he had just been caught stealing from a corpse. I took another step forward, then another. Dania instinctively stepped backward, as if my presence terrified her more than anything. The silence in the room was suffocating. I tilted my head slightly, watching as Dania's mind raced for an excuse, a lie, anything that could fix the situation. But how do you explain kissing your husband's best friend while your husband, who was supposed to be in a wheelchair, stands before you? She swallowed hard. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Ethan, always the arrogant one, was the first to snap out of it. He let out a nervous chuckle, stepping forward slightly. "Richard," he said, forcing a smile. "Man, this is incredible. You can walk?" I ignored him. My eyes never left Dania. She was still trembling. I could see the desperation in her expression, the way her mind was still trying to piece together a story, something to explain away the betrayal. Let's see how well she lies. I finally spoke, my voice eerily calm. "Yes, Dania." My tone was cold, detached. "I can walk." Her lips trembled. Richard, I don't. You don't what? I took another step closer. You don't know what's happening? You don't know how to explain why my so-called best friend had his tongue down your throat the first time I stood on my feet in 3 years. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no words. I let out a slow exhale and turned my gaze to Ethan. You, I said flatly, were supposed to be my friend. Ethan had the audacity to scoff. Come on, Richard. Don't. Make this dramatic. You've been in that chair for 3 years. Dania was lonely. She needed someone. I felt something in my chest tighten, not from pain, but from the sheer audacity of his words. Dania was lonely? She needed someone? What about me? I was the one who spent 3 years trapped in my own body. I was the one who woke up every morning in a house where my own wife treated me like a burden. I was the one who had to watch, helpless, as my so-called best friend hovered a little too close, touched her a little too often, and now Ethan had the nerve to act like I was the bad guy for being angry. A bitter laugh escaped me. Dania flinched. Richard, it's not what it looks like. She tried again, her voice uneven. I turned, back to her. Oh? So you weren't kissing Ethan? She swallowed. It just happened. I swear, it wasn't. I cut her off, my voice sharp. How long? Dania blinked. What? I took another step forward. My legs still felt weak, but my rage was stronger than my body's limits. How long? I repeated, my tone like ice. How long have you been sneaking behind my back? How long have you been kissing him? Ethan stiffened. Dania's hands shook at her sides. Richard, I clenched my jaw. Don't lie to me, Dania. Her lips trembled. Then softly, she exhaled. Almost a year. The words hit me like a knife to the gut. A year. I had spent every single day of this past year relearning how to stand for her, every painful therapy session, every agonizing night when my muscles cramped and locked up. I pushed through it all thinking, if I can walk again, Dania will look at me the way she used to. I thought I was fighting for our marriage. But in reality, Dania had already given up on me a long time ago. I let out a slow breath. A year, I echoed. Dania looked away, ashamed. Ethan, however, had the audacity to shrug. Listen, man, you're taking this way too personally. I didn't let him finish. My fist collided with his jaw before he could say another word. Ethan stumbled back, gripping his face. Richard, what the hell? He shouted. I stepped closer, my voice low. Dangerous. You want to tell me what's personal about my wife screwing my best friend while I spent every day fighting just to walk again? Ethan's face darkened. You don't get it, do you? Dania was never happy with you. She felt trapped, Richard. She deserves better than playing nurse to some cripple for the rest of her life. Dania gasped. Ethan! But it was too late. Because, in that moment, something snapped inside me. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel pain. I just felt nothing. I turned to Dania. Is that true? My voice was quiet. Too quiet. Her lower lip trembled. She didn't answer. And that silence was the biggest answer of all. I looked at my wife, the woman who once stood beside me at the altar, the woman who once vowed to love me in sickness and in health, the woman who had spent an entire year betraying me while I thought she was supporting me. I should have been devastated. I should have been heartbroken. But instead, I just felt tired. I nodded slowly, stepping back. I see. Dania's eyes filled with panic. Richard, wait, I held up a hand. Cold, final, don't. My voice was like steel. I don't need your apologies. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I turned toward the door. My legs still shook from the strain of standing for too long. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't crawling anymore. I was walking away. I didn't Know how I got home? My mind felt blank, my legs barely strong enough to hold me up, but I kept walking. The moment I left that room, left Dania and Ethan standing there, I thought I would feel something. Rage, grief, something, but I just felt empty. 3 years. 3 damn years of suffering, of fighting, of convincing myself that if I just held on, Dania would see me again, that she would love me again. But now I knew the truth. She never did. Richard's breaking point, by the time I reached my house, my body was screaming in pain. My legs trembled violently, my muscles seizing up from the exertion. I barely made it inside before my knees buckled. I crashed to the floor, gasping for breath, sweat dripping down my forehead. I clenched my fists against the hardwood, my nails, digging into my palms. I should have known. I should have seen the signs. The way Dania stopped looking at me like a husband. The way she never touched me, never kissed me, never spoke to me unless necessary. She had given up on me a long time ago, and I had been too blind, too desperate to admit it. My breathing was ragged. My heart pounded violently in my chest, but it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from the realization that I had been a fool, that the woman I had been holding on to wasn't mine, that maybe she never was. Dania's panic. A realization. Too late. Dania stood frozen in the living room, her fingers clutching the edge of the couch. Richard was gone. He had walked away without another word. She had expected him to scream at her, demand answers, call her names, maybe even throw something, but instead, he had looked at her, just looked, and the way his expression shifted, like something inside him had just died, made her stomach drop. For the past 3 years, she had told herself that it didn't matter, that Richard would never recover, never walk again, never be the man he used to be. She had told herself that Ethan was the man she should have been with all along, but now she couldn't stop shaking, because Richard had stood, and more than that, he had left, and for the first time in a long time, Dania felt something close to fear. Memories that cut deep. Dania sank onto the couch, gripping her temples. She hadn't always been this way. Once, she had loved Richard, or at least she thought. She did. But after the accident, everything had changed. He had gone from the strong, confident man she admired to a broken shell trapped in that wheelchair, depending on her for everything. At first, she had tried to be a good wife. Tried to convince herself that his condition didn't change how she felt about him, but over time, the exhaustion set in. The endless care, the responsibility of being his everything, the realization that he would never be the man she once knew, and then there was Ethan. Ethan, who had always been there. Ethan, who made her laugh when Richard barely spoke. Ethan, who still stood tall, strong, confident, everything Richard no longer was. She had told herself that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only turned to Ethan after Richard had given up on their marriage first. But now she wasn't so sure, because when Richard looked at her today, there was no pleading, no desperation, just cold detachment, like he had finally given up on her. And for some reason, that terrified her. Ethan's arrogance and Dania's doubt. "You're overthinking," Ethan muttered from the other side of the room, rubbing his jaw where Richard had hit him. Dania's hands curled into fists. "He's never hit anyone before," Ethan scoffed. "Yeah, well, guess that wheelchair made him soft. He finally grew a spine." Dania flinched. She didn't know why, but the way Ethan said it bothered her. For years, she had compared the two. Of them, Ethan and Richard. And Ethan had always won. He was charming, exciting, confident. He knew how to take control, how to make her feel wanted, how to remind her she was still desired. But right now, something about Ethan felt off. "You're still choosing him?" Ethan's voice turned sharp. "After everything, you're still thinking about Richard?" Dania swallowed hard. "No, Dania." Ethan's voice was low, warning. Richard is nothing but dead weight. He'll never be the man you want him to be. She should have agreed. She should have felt relieved that Richard had finally walked away, but instead, all she felt was guilt, and that terrified her more than anything. Richard's breaking point. A decision is made back at home. Richard stared at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. For 3 years, he had allowed himself to believe that love was enough, that if he fought hard enough, Dania would come back to him, that if he pushed through the pain, she would look at him like she once did. But she never would, because Dania didn't love him. She never did. And now he was finally done. He picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before he typed the words he should have said long ago. Dania, let's get a divorce. He hit send, and for the first time in years, he felt free. Dania stared at the message on her phone, her heart hammering in her chest. Dania, let's get a divorce. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the device. The words felt unreal. For 3 years, she had expected Richard to beg, to plead, to fight for her, even if it was just out of pride. But he hadn't. He had just walked away. She should feel relieved. This was what she had been waiting for, wasn't it? Then why did her chest feel like it was caving in? You okay? Ethan's voice pulled her out of her trance. She looked up, eyes still wide with disbelief. He asked for a divorce. Ethan didn't react the way she expected. No anger, no shock, no concern, just mild amusement. Well, that makes things easier. He stretched, cracking his knuckles. Now you don't have to pretend anymore. Dania swallowed hard. Aren't you even a little surprised? Ethan shrugged. Not really. Something about his tone felt off. She watched him carefully. The Ethan she knew would have at least pretended to be on her side. He would have comforted her, reassured her that she was making the right choice. But instead, he was acting like this was just another minor inconvenience. Something ugly twisted in her stomach, something that felt a lot like doubt. Dania set her phone down, trying to shake, the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Ethan, she hesitated. Do you ever wonder if we made a mistake? Ethan scoffed. Mistake? He let out a sharp laugh. Dania, you're finally free of a crippled husband. You should be celebrating. The way he said it made her flinch. She had been thinking it for years, hadn't she? That Richard wasn't strong enough anymore. That she needed someone whole. But hearing Ethan say it so coldly made something in her stomach turn. Richard had never once spoken about her with such cruelty. Even in his anger, even when he had caught them together, his voice had been calm, controlled, not like this, not spiteful. She studied Ethan carefully for the first time in a long time, the way he smirked, the way he leaned back, completely unbothered by what had just happened. Something about it felt wrong. Ethan had always pushed her away from Richard, always whispered in her ear about how much better off she'd be without him, how she deserved more. What if she had been played? Dania's throat went dry. Ethan, tell me the truth. Ethan arched an eyebrow. About? Did you... She hesitated, but then forced the words out. Did you ever interfere? With Richard's accident, I mean. Ethan's face didn't change, but his silence was answer enough. Dania's blood ran cold. She had never questioned it before. Never once considered that Ethan had anything to do with what happened to Richard. But now, as she watched his expression shift, his lips curling into something unreadable, she felt like she had been blind this whole time. You're overthinking, Ethan finally said, his voice too smooth, too relaxed. Her chest tightened. Ethan, just tell me. He smirked, and that's when she knew. He had been involved. Maybe he hadn't caused the accident directly, but he had known something, and he had let Richard suffer. Let her believe Richard would never walk again. And why? So she would turn to him instead, so she would see Richard as weak, so she would choose him. Dania felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything made sense now. The way Ethan had always been there. The way he had always pushed her doubts when she had moments of guilt. The way he had never been surprised by anything that happened because he had orchestrated it and she had been too blind to see it. Her hands shook. "Did you love me?" Ethan let out a mocking laugh. "Love you? Oh, Dania, you were just convenient." Her heart stopped. Every memory, every night they had spent together, every stolen moment when she had thought Ethan was the one she truly loved, suddenly felt like a sick joke. "You," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "You used me." Ethan leaned closer, his voice low. "I got what I wanted." Dania staggered backward, as if his words had physically wounded her. She had destroyed her marriage for this man. For a man who had never loved her, never cared, never wanted her for anything more than a game. And Richard? The man she had spent years resenting? He had been the only one who had ever truly loved her, and she had thrown him away. Dania grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. She pulled up Richard's message. "Dania, let's get a divorce." Her vision blurred. She quickly typed a response. "Richard, please, let's talk." Her finger hovered over the send button. But she hesitated. Because deep down, she already knew Richard was done. She had spent 3 years waiting for a man who had never truly wanted her. And now, she had lost the only man who ever did. And there was no going back. Richard sat in his study, staring at the divorce papers in front of him. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He had spent 3 years clinging to a lie. But today he was finally free. He picked up the pen. Just as he was about to sign, his phone buzzed. "Dania," he let it ring. It stopped. Then it rang again. He exhaled, setting the pen down. He already knew what this was. Regret, desperation, and most of all, fear. She had spent years thinking she could do better. Years convincing herself that she was trapped with a weak man. And now that she had lost everything, she was scrambling to undo what she had done. But it was too late. Dania sat in the car outside Richard's house, her fingers clutching the phone so tightly it hurt. He wasn't answering. Her heart pounded, her mind racing with a million things she wanted to say. But the truth was, she didn't even know where to begin. How did she apologize for destroying him? For betraying a man who had only ever loved her? She had thought Richard was weak, that Ethan was the stronger, better choice. But Ethan had been a lie, and Richard had been the only real thing she had ever had. Tears blurred her vision. She had to fix this. Somehow she had to fix this. With shaky hands, she stepped out of the car and knocked on his door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. "Richard, please," she whispered. She knocked harder. The door swung open, and there he stood, tall, strong, whole. For the first time in years, Dania had to look up at him. She swallowed hard. "Richard, He turned without a word and walked away. No limp, no hesitation, like he had never been broken at all. Her breath hitched. She followed him inside, her hands trembling. "Please, just talk to me." He stopped in the middle of the room, his back to her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, he spoke. "Talk to you? The way you talked to Ethan behind my back?" Dania flinched, her throat tightened. "I know I messed up, but..." Richard turned. His expression was unreadable. "But what?" Dania opened her mouth. No words came out because there was no excuse. She had betrayed him, not once, not twice, for an entire year. And now, he was done. Richard stepped closer, his voice calm. Too calm. "Tell me, Dania, what exactly are you sorry for?" Her lips parted. He tilted his head. "Are you sorry for kissing Ethan?" She swallowed. Are you sorry for sneaking behind my back while I was learning how to walk again? Her hands shook. Or are you just sorry that I found out? Dania felt the walls closing in around her because he wasn't yelling. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging her to stay. He was looking at her like she was nothing. And that was worse than anything. Richard, I made a mistake. She choked out. His eyes stayed cold. No, Dania. You made a choice. A tear slipped down her cheek. I never stopped caring about you. He let out a low laugh. It wasn't amused. It was cruel. Caring? He stepped even closer. Did you care when you let Ethan touch you? Dania sucked in a breath. He took another step forward. Did you care when you let him kiss you in my house? She couldn't breathe. Richard leaned in slightly, his voice a whisper of destruction. Did you care when I was alone every night, wondering if my wife would ever love me again? Dania broke. A sob escaped her. I was confused. Richard straightened, his expression like stone. No, Dania. His voice was cold. You were selfish. Her heart shattered, because he was right. She hadn't been confused. She had been selfish. She had wanted Ethan because she thought she deserved better. And now, she had nothing. She reached out, desperation clawing at her. Please, don't do this. Richard stepped back, like her touch disgusted him. Dania felt her chest tighten. I love you, she whispered. Richard stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then he exhaled and said the most painful words of all. I don't care. Dania stood frozen, unable to move. Richard picked up the divorce papers from the table, turned to the last page, and signed his name. Then, without a glance, he held them out to her. Dania's hands trembled as she reached for them. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Richard wasn't hers anymore. The realization slammed into her like a wrecking ball. She had lost him, and there was nothing she could do to change that. Richard took a step back. We're done, Dania. Tears streamed down her face. You don't mean that. His gaze was unreadable. I do. Dania sucked in a breath, choking on regret. Because it wasn't just the marriage that was ending. It was everything. Every memory. Every future they could have had. Richard was walking away, and for the first time, Dania realized she was the one left behind. She had spent years resenting him, and now she was the one on her knees begging him to stay. But Richard? Richard was already gone. The divorce was finalized. Dania had signed the papers with shaking hands, but Richard hadn't stayed to watch. There was nothing left to say. No second chances, no dramatic confessions, just silence. And now, she was alone. Your house felt too big, too empty. The bed felt too cold. For years, she had convinced herself that Richard had been a burden, that she had been trapped. But now, she realized the truth. Richard had never been the burden. She had. She was the one who had taken his love for granted, the one who had pushed him away while he fought for their marriage. And now, she had no one left to blame but herself. Richard sat on the balcony of his new apartment, staring out at the city skyline. It had been a long time since he felt this free. For 3 years, he had lived like a prisoner in his own home. Now, for the first time, in a long time, he could finally breathe. There was no more pain. No more waiting for a wife who had already checked out of their marriage long ago. No more wondering if he was enough, because he had finally realized something. He was, and he always had been. He had just been giving his love to the wrong person. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, but he already knew who it was. Dania. Richard. Can we talk? He stared at the message for a long time. Once, he would have dropped everything to answer. Once, he would have fought for her. But now he felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no love. Just peace. He typed a single word in response. Richard. No. Then he blocked the number. And just like that, Dania was gone. For good. Dania sat in her car, gripping her phone so hard her fingers turned white. He had blocked her. Richard had truly let her. Oh, the tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her punishment. This was what she deserved. For years, she had thought Richard was the weak one. But in the end, she was the one who had been broken all along. And now, there was no one left to pick up the pieces. She looked up at the house they had once shared, the place she had thought she had been trapped in. Now, it was just another empty space. Just like her. With a deep breath, she started the car and drove away. But no matter how far she went, she knew she would never escape the weight of her own regret, because no matter what she did, she would never get Richard back. Richard stepped into the cafe, shaking his head as he saw the line. He wasn't in a rush, though. For the first time. In years, he had all the time in the world. He ordered his coffee, then turned to leave. And then, a soft voice behind him made him stop. Excuse me? You dropped this. He turned and found himself staring into warm brown eyes. The woman smiled, holding out his wallet. She was beautiful. But more than that, there was kindness in her eyes, a warmth that Dania had never shown him, even in their best moments. Richard smiled. Maybe fate wasn't so cruel after all. Maybe after everything, he was finally getting a second chance.